lot of votes, and yet another, I'll say, pro-militaristic response to what's going on with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. 10,499 votes cast yesterday at Smerconish.com. Here was the question: does greater peril come from confronting Putin or leaving him unchecked? Confronting him or leaving him unchecked? Which is the more dangerous path? 88.71%. Let's call it 90-10. 90% said leaving him unchecked is the more perilous path, meaning what? He's got to be confronted. He's got to be confronted. I want to take my time at the outset of the program, run through some of the headlines of the day from Smerconish.com and the newsletter, because there's a whole mix, a lot of it international, a lot of it focused on Ukraine, and some interesting domestic stories as well, and I want to do them all. Do you remember when Bob Woodward and Robert Costa wrote Peril? It was one of the post-Trump books that I read, devoured actually, spent a lot of time discussing. Robert Costa was my guest here on POTUS. He was also my guest on CNN. In fact, he was also a guest of the Philadelphia Free Library, and I came out on a school night and moderated that conversation. So I think I know the subject matter of the Costa-Woodward book well. And you will recall that one of the big takeaways was that they reported that on multiple occasions, I want to say 2 occasions, one close to the election, one close to the inauguration, meaning the 2020 election and then the inauguration in January of 21 of Joe Biden, that on 2 occasions, General Milley had conversations with his Chinese counterparts and said, don't worry, we're not going to launch a nuclear strike. And I'm doing this all from memory, but we debated here on radio the propriety of giving a heads up to your military counterpart. Like, what's up with that? What if we needed to launch a nuclear strike? Would it really have been correct for Milley to assure his counterpart that there wouldn't be that type of initiated action? Maybe there would need to be. We had a whole conversation about that, which I think you have to remember to appreciate the story that I put in the lead position today at Smerconish.com. And TC, you fact check me if my recollection of General Milley and his Chinese counterpart and what went on there is incorrect.
No, it's completely accurate. I'm looking at a headline from NPR from September of this past year. So September 2021, when the book came out. General Milley defends his call to a Chinese general about Trump's rhetoric and the United States, says he was conducting the duties of his office, not circumventing presidential authority, when he spoke to his Chinese counterpart shortly before last year's election, according to a statement the Pentagon issued Wednesday. Milley's actions in the final months of former President Donald Trump's term made headlines this week after a new book by journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa said the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was attempting to head off a potential armed conflict when he called the Chinese general.
So my point is this: there, of course, needs to be that back channel means of communication. I questioned at the time whether Milley had exceeded his role. But here's today's story. Here is today's story. Today's story is, I'll give you the takeaway and then I'll quote from it, that back channel of communications is not functioning right now with Russia. It's the Washington Post that is reporting this. Repeated attempts by the United States top defense and military leaders to speak with their Russian counterparts have been rejected by Moscow for the last month, leaving the world's 2 greatest nuclear powers in the dark about explanations for military movements and raising fears of a major miscalculation or battlefield accident. And then they go on and they talk about how General Milley and Secretary Austin have tried to set up phone calls with Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. By the way, he's the guy that some of the reports say is now MIA. He is the defense minister that some reports say has not been heard from in the last couple of days. And these repeated attempts by Austin and Milley, not previously reported, come as Russia conducts operations near the borders of NATO members. Moscow and Washington maintain a deconfliction channel, but current and former officials say contact from higher-ranking military leaders is needed to avoid unnecessary escalation or confusion. And then there's a quote in the Washington Post story from Admiral Stavridis, my recent guest here on POTUS, the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, who says there is a high risk of escalation without the firebreak of direct contact between the most senior officials. Very young people are flying in jets, operating warships, and conducting combat operations in the Ukrainian war. They are not seasoned diplomats, and their actions in the heat of operations can be misunderstood. We've got to avoid a scenario where NATO and Russia are sleepwalking into war because senior leaders can't pick up a phone and explain to each other what's happening. So that, to me, is the biggest news of the day. A second interesting story also posted at Smerconish.com. This is from the Wall Street Journal. NATO now estimating that Russia has lost as much as 1/5 of its combat forces sent to Ukraine in about a month of fighting. This as the president is, of course, overseas meeting with his NATO counterparts. Between 7,000 and 15,000 Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine, and up to 40,000 Russian troops in total killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. So it underscores just how much this Russian invasion has become bogged down after a series of what the experts call operational missteps on the part of Russia. In the world of diplomacy, Madeleine Albright is gone. Madeleine Jana Corbel Albright, the first female Secretary of State, passed Wednesday at age 84, arrived in the USA as a young girl from war-torn Czechoslovakia before becoming a feminist icon. This is interesting to put sort of all together with the pieces of what's going on in Ukraine. One of the achievements for which she's credited when she was Secretary of State under President Clinton in the late 1990s was her pushing for NATO expansion eastward into the former Soviet bloc. And, of course, we've had the conversation here, and I've talked about the Vladimir Posner video, the Yale speech that I recommend everybody watch, where Posner explains that it was that expansion into the so-called Baltic states, the former Soviet satellite nations, that has been the burr in the saddle of Putin that is, he says, Posner says, directly related to exactly what's going on today with Russia, in not a defense, but rather an explanation of why Putin is doing what he's doing. It's not just the news of the day from Ukraine. There is a really interesting domestic political story that the New York Times has today, and it is this. Mark Pomerantz is one of the two lead investigators, prosecutors being relied on by Cy Vance Jr., the so-called Manhattan District Attorney. He left office in January. Alvin Bragg is the individual who took his place. This is the investigation that has yielded an indictment of the CFO of the Trump Organization. And it's the investigation about which there's been the greatest speculation recently as to whether Donald Trump will be indicted, making him, if he were, the first former United States president to be indicted. Pomerantz is one of the two prosecutors who left the office of Bragg. Then came the speculation that, hey, there's not going to be an indictment of Donald Trump. And we talked about this, and Michael Cohen was a guest of mine here on POTUS recently because the crimes for which Trump would be charged hinge on what his intention was. And the stories that had come out in the New York Times speculated that the holdback on the part of Alvin Bragg, the new Manhattan District Attorney, is that he'd have to rely on Michael Cohen's testimony as to what was Donald Trump's intent. And where Cohen is a convicted felon, the belief was he's not going to be a strong witness, and we don't have enough. Okay, that was all of the speculation around what's going on with the Bragg investigation. What's the new story? I posted today at Smerconish.com the actual letter of resignation from Pomerantz. And what does it say? It says he thinks Donald Trump committed crimes. In other words, it totally backs up what all the reporting has been, except now you've got it in the words of the prosecutor himself, and in disgust, he left that office. One of the senior, this is the way the Times is reporting it today, one of the senior Manhattan prosecutors who investigated Donald J. Trump believed the former president was, quote, guilty of numerous felony violations and that it was a, quote, grave failure of justice not to hold him accountable, according to a copy of the resignation letter. The prosecutor is Mark F. Pomerantz. He submitted his resignation last month after the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg abruptly stopped pursuing an indictment of Trump. I have to say, the story, and I really recommend you read the story, but read the resignation letter. It represents the first time that you've got someone in the investigation explicitly stating his belief that they could have convicted Trump. But Alvin Bragg doesn't agree, and so says Pomerantz that Bragg's decision was contrary to the public interest, and Bragg has balked at pursuing an indictment. The story goes on to say that just before he left office, Cyrus Vance Jr. was sort of teeing up the prosecution of Donald Trump, to which I ask, well, if that's true, why didn't he then indict him? Why didn't he do it on his watch? Very easy to say what one would have done, but if you had the opportunity and you didn't do it, well, then what are we to make of that? Scheme to defraud is what the charges were that they were envisioning, and as I've pointed out, not only from a legal standpoint do you have the difficulty of, well, what was the president's intent? Did he really intend to defraud? Did he believe the valuations that he was listing for the real estate? But the added problem that you have here is the banks didn't suffer. The banks made money. The banks seemingly aren't an aggrieved party. So at the end, Pomerantz was recommending, let's not make it a scheme to defraud case. Let's make it instead a falsifying business records case, much easier to prove. But the prosecution apparently won't take place. And remember, I know it gets confusing, but Letitia James is the Attorney General of New York. She can only bring a civil case. She's been working in tandem with the Manhattan DA. But now we know the backstory. That's really most important. Now we know the backstory as to why there probably won't be a prosecution of Donald Trump. He still has peril in Georgia. He still has peril because now there's a civil suit moving forward pertaining to January 6th. You've got the January 6th investigation. I mean, there's still a lot of other issues out there, but this was the biggie. This was the biggie, and now there is confirmation that these prosecutors left. There were two of them. One of them is Pomerantz, and that they left because Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, is not interested, at least at this stage, in bringing the prosecution. While I'm at it, in other Trump news, Smerconish.com about to be ripped off by Trump Jr. Yeah, they are launching. You tell me if this sounds familiar. Trump Jr. has just announced that he is launching a news aggregation app called MXM. What does that represent, TC? That must represent something.
The different
minute
M's.
by minute.
Minute by minute.
Minute by minute.
Yep.
That's what it is. Right. So they are saying that where Drudge has lost its influence and that you've got Apple News out there and Google News out there that they think that they need, I cannot freaking believe that this is their mantra. Okay, what is our mantra? Our mantra is balance delivered daily. Trump Jr. is launching a news aggregation website where their mantra is mainstream news without mainstream bias. And the part of this story that most warmed my heart is that they are launching with a staff of 8 curators.
Okay,
TC,
it's so funny.
What is our staff of curators?
One.
Me.
It is hysterical that's what you, because that jumped out at me as well. I was like, 8? Like, what?
Yeah.
Like, I completely, and then the other thing that I looked for, because I was curious, I was like, if their logo is purple, he's gonna lose it. Like, he's
gonna go rip shit.
It's not. It's blue.
True.
It's blue. It's not purple.
Thank
it's blue,
God.
and they have 2 M's like side by side. But I
at
went and
its
looked.
core, that's what Smerconish.com is.
It's
It is an
I know.
aggregation. It's me giving you links that I painstakingly, as I'm going through them right now.
Yeah, but Michael,
painstakingly.
The difference is that your links come from both sides of the ideological spectrum. You're not giving from the right or from the left. There is not a chance that Donald Trump Jr.'s aggregation is going to include the whole ideological spectrum. It's not going to happen.
There's not a chance that Donald Trump Jr. is going to be remotely involved in deciding what the hell shows up on that
His
site.
staff
the
of
way
8.
I am.
His staff of 8 is going to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. So here's an indication of the lengths to which I go to try and present the balance. I'm watching the Ketanji Brown Jackson confirmation hearing yesterday, and the presidential wannabes continued to use it as an opportunity to placate the base, having little or nothing to do with her role as a Supreme Court justice. I explained all that in yesterday's program. I don't want to be repetitive and do it again today. But there was a very emotive moment where Cory Booker was essentially in tears, and he brought Judge Jackson essentially to tears. So I'll play 20 seconds of it in case you missed it. But Cory Booker, being from the great Garden State, I link today at nj.com, newjersey.com. I wanted the hometown reporting, which says, his voice cracking and his eyes tearing. U.S. Senator Cory Booker spent his time at Wednesday's Senate Judiciary Committee hearing touting Ketanji Brown Jackson, the historic nomination of the first black woman on the U.S. Supreme Court. His words left Jackson wiping her tears away as well. Play it.
Loved
as
this
well.
nation,
Play it.
even though there were laws preventing them,
Play it.
even though there were laws preventing them,
Play it.
even though there were.
Geez,
I'm having some reverb. Yeah, I'm having some reverb. Apologies to that, but it was, it is a shame. I'm not sure what was going on with that.
Here's the takeaway. The takeaway from that is that I said, unless there were a major stumble, she was secure. They don't need 60 votes. They need 50 plus 1. They have that if all Democrats toe the line, and they will, plus Vice President Kamala Harris. Nothing happened yesterday with regard to Judge Jackson's confirmation that jeopardizes it, in my view. That's what I wanted you to know about that. I can barely read the story from the Daily Oklahoman. A high school community of a small, rural Oklahoma town in mourning after 6 teenage girls were killed in a collision. Tishomingo, I think is the pronunciation, 100 miles southeast of Oklahoma City. 6 of them, two in the front seat, belted, 4 in the back seat, unbelted. A horrific, I mean, the type of thing that emotionally scars a community for which you never get over. We've had some of these things take place, in Pennsylvania. Maybe not 6 at once, but a particular accident that I can recall happening about 2 years ago in the Poconos. And it's just like the sort of thing where you drive through an intersection, and I don't even know what I'm trying to say, other than my heart grieves for the people of Oklahoma. I've visited Oklahoma, and I'm just brokenhearted to even read that story. Tough to even discuss. The SAT and ACT, if they weren't already on their last legs, they certainly are now. Trustees of California State University, the largest 4-year university system in the nation, Cal State I'm talking about, agreed yesterday to permanently drop the SAT and ACT standardized tests in their admissions process. This comes after the University of California led the way, making the bold decision back in 2020 to drop the exams, triggering a national debate over whether the tests unfairly discriminate against disadvantaged students or provide a useful tool to evaluate college applicants. I went with the LA Times reporting. That's a significant story. By the way, mine was not a discrimination thought, although I certainly recognize my opposition, I should say, is not predicated on discrimination, although I certainly recognize that people who live in my neighborhood, their kids are all taking prep tests. I know what it's like to drive the gauntlet of getting in and out of the parking lot at the service, not far from my home studio, because there's a whole cottage industry of test prepping that many people can't afford. And yet if you don't do it, you're not on equal footing. It's not enough to go to school and do well. No, my beef is I don't like the idea of having your entire K through 12 experience evaluated based on how you perform on one Saturday morning. And I say this as someone who never did well on standardized tests, and I have a bias that is, plain for all to see. It was not an effective or accurate barometer of my academic abilities. And the idea that someone works hard K through 12 and does all the right things and is a solid citizen and is active in extracurriculars, but then, because of the Common App, you get a school that's overwhelmed with the number of applications. So what must they do just to get through the stack? The process has to begin with a sort of a weaning of the herd where they're looking at numbers only. That is my bias against the ACT and the SAT. And finally, and then I'll stop and we'll open the telephone lines in a moment, but there is this headline from all across the country. I went with a Fox New York affiliate. With Americans still in shock over jaw-dropping rising gas prices, a few proposals now floating around the Congress and elsewhere about offering relief to drivers. Los Angeles on Tuesday became the first major city in the U.S. to reach an average gas price of $6 or more. That's according to Gas Buddy, which reported the national gas average price right now beginning slightly to decline since its peak of $4.35 per gallon on March 10. There's a proposal out there from a representative from California and a representative from Illinois who are proposing, here's what they're proposing, and this is important that you follow this because it's today's survey question. They want Americans to get an energy rebate of $100 per month and $100 for each dependent for the rest of 2022 in any month, certainly this month, where the national average gas prices exceed $4 a gallon. Should there be, today's survey question at Smerconish.com, should Americans receive a $100 per month energy rebate in any month where national average gas prices exceed $4 a gallon? Go vote on today's survey question. Hit Smerconish.com. There's a lot more there, but that's sort of the brief. And I'm eager to chat with all of you about these headlines. You can take your pick. We can talk about what I led with, how top Russian military leaders aren't answering the telephone. That's a scary thought. The casualties on the part of the Russians being significantly higher than Putin could ever have anticipated. The passing of Madeleine Albright, the Trump declining odds of him being indicted. You know what I've said all along. If he wants the nomination, he gets it as long as he's unindicted, solvent, and healthy. And those three things are still in effect today, and he seemingly wants it. But you can talk about that as well, or we can just talk about Donald Trump Jr.'s ripoff of Smerconish.com. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm at 855-486-1776, 855-486-1776.